The afternoon of March 21, 2002 felt ordinary, quiet, predictable, safe. In the suburban town of Walton-on-Thames, school had just ended, and children spilled onto the streets, laughing, heading home the way they always did. Among them was 13-year-old Milly Dowler. She should have been home within minutes. But she never made it. At first, nothing seemed out of place. A familiar route, a short walk, a girl who had taken that same path countless times before. But as minutes turned into hours and hours into a night filled with dread, something shifted. A routine day had quietly transformed into the beginning of a nightmare. Her parents waited, then worried, then panicked. Because deep down, there's a moment every parent fears, the realization that something is terribly wrong. And for Milly's family, that moment came fast, and it never left. What followed was one of the most haunting and disturbing cases in British criminal history. A case that would stretch over years. A case filled with unanswered questions, false hope, and a devastating truth hidden in plain sight. But what made this story even darker wasn't just what happened to Milly. It was what happened after she disappeared. Because while a family clung desperately to hope, someone somewhere already knew the truth. And others would exploit that hope in ways no one could have imagined. This is not just the story of a missing girl. This is the story of a crime that shook a nation, exposed a predator hiding in the shadows, and revealed a betrayal that went far beyond the crime itself. This is the story of Milly Dowler. The last confirmed sighting of Milly Dowler was so ordinary, so painfully routine, that no one could have imagined it would become the final piece of a timeline investigators would later replay again and again. It was just after school on March 21, 2002. The air carried that familiar early spring chill, the kind that lingers even when the sun is out. Students from Heathside School poured out onto the streets of Walton-on-Thames, breaking into smaller groups as they headed home. Among them was 13-year-old Milly, quiet, thoughtful, known to those around her as kind and reserved. She walked alone. That in itself wasn't unusual. Station Avenue was a route she knew well. It was a path she had taken many times before, a straight, uneventful walk that should have brought her safely back to her front door in less than 30 minutes. There were houses, passing cars, the occasional pedestrian. Nothing about it screamed danger. But danger doesn't always announce itself. Somewhere along that road, in those ordinary moments between school and home, something happened. Something sudden, something final. And no one saw it. When Milly didn't return home at the expected time, her parents, Bob and Sally Dowler, began to worry. At first, it was the kind of worry most parents know, a late bus, a stop at a friend's house, a simple delay. But as the minutes ticked by, unease began to settle in. They tried calling her phone. It rang, but there was no answer. By early evening, that unease had turned into something heavier, something harder to ignore. This wasn't like Milly. She was responsible, predictable. She didn't just disappear without telling someone. By nightfall, the fear was undeniable. Milly Dowler was missing. Police were contacted, and almost immediately the situation escalated. Officers began tracing her last known movements, retracing her steps from school, speaking to classmates, searching the streets she would have walked. Her route became a map of questions, each corner, each stretch of pavement holding the possibility of an answer. But the answers didn't come. Instead, what emerged was silence. No witnesses who saw anything unusual, no clear signs of struggle, no immediate evidence pointing to where she had gone or who she had encountered. It was as if she had simply vanished. As the search intensified, the scale of the investigation grew rapidly. Posters bearing Milly's face appeared across Walton-on-Thames and beyond. Her school photo, bright-eyed, innocent, became a symbol of urgency, of desperation. The public was asked for help. Appeals were broadcast. Her disappearance began to ripple outward, catching the attention of the nation. Behind the scenes, detectives were already considering the possibilities. No one wanted to speak out loud. Runaway. Unlikely. Accident. No evidence. Abduction. That possibility lingered, heavy and unspoken, casting a shadow over every step of the investigation. Meanwhile, her family clung to hope. Bob and Sally Dowler refused to believe the worst. They couldn't. Not yet. Not without answers. They held onto every possibility, every scenario where Milly was still alive, still out there, waiting to be found. Then something happened. Milly's phone activity suggested she might still be alive. Voicemails on her mobile phone were being accessed. Messages were being deleted. To her parents, this meant one thing: Milly could be listening to them. She could be trying to reach out. She could be alive somewhere, unable to come home. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough. They left messages for her, pleading, encouraging, telling her they loved her, that she could come back, that everything would be okay. Every deleted message felt like a sign. A sign she was there. A sign she was trying. But what they didn't know, what no one knew at the time, was that this hope was built on something deeply disturbing, something that would later shock the entire country. Because those messages weren't being accessed by Milly. As days turned into weeks, the search effort expanded further. Police combed through nearby areas, including fields, wooded land, and abandoned spaces. Volunteers joined in, walking through muddy terrain, calling her name, refusing to give up. The case began to dominate headlines. A missing schoolgirl, a vanishing without a trace, a family waiting for answers that refused to come. And yet, despite the growing attention, despite the increasing urgency, there was still nothing concrete. No breakthrough, no clear suspect, no explanation. Just absence. And time. Time in cases like this is both an ally and an enemy. The longer it passes, the more evidence fades, memories blur, opportunities slip away. But it also builds pressure on investigators, on witnesses, on anyone who might know something but hasn't yet come forward. Somewhere someone knew. That belief drove the investigation forward. But the truth was darker than anyone imagined. Because while the public searched, while the family hoped, while the police worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle, a predator was already out there, watching, waiting, and carrying a secret that would take years to uncover. In the early stages of the investigation, there were no clear links to any known offender. No immediate red flags pointing toward a specific individual. But behind that uncertainty, there was a chilling reality. This was not a random act in the way people might hope. This was calculated, opportunistic, and carried out by someone who understood how to blend into the ordinary. The idea that such a person could exist, could move through the same streets, pass by unnoticed, live among unsuspecting neighbors, was almost impossible to grasp. And yet, it was the only explanation that fit. As the search entered its second week, hope began to shift. Not disappear, but change. It became quieter, more fragile, less certain. The Dowlers continued to speak publicly, urging anyone with information to come forward. Their voices carried both strength and heartbreak, a family refusing to give up, even as the weight of uncertainty pressed down on them. But behind the scenes, investigators were preparing for a possibility they could no longer ignore. That this case might not end with a reunion. That the answers they were searching for might lead somewhere far more devastating. Still, they kept searching. Because until there was proof, until there was certainty, Milly Dowler was not just a victim. She was a missing girl. and someone, somewhere had taken her. The question was who? And how had they managed to leave behind almost nothing at all? As the days stretched into months, the investigation began to evolve. New leads were followed. Old ones were re-examined. Every detail, no matter how small, was scrutinized. Patterns were considered. Possibilities explored. But the case remained stubbornly unresolved. And then, nearly 6 months after Milly disappeared, a discovery would shatter everything. A discovery that would confirm the fears no one wanted to face, and mark the beginning of a new phase in the search for truth. Because the mystery of what happened to Milly Dowler was about to take a devastating turn. And the answers, when they finally came, would reveal a darkness far deeper than anyone had imagined. 6 months. That's how long the silence lasted. 6 months of searching, of waiting, of holding on to a hope that grew thinner with each passing day. 6 months of unanswered questions, dead ends, and the haunting absence of a 13-year-old girl who had simply vanished. Then on September 18, 2002, that silence was broken. Deep within Yateley Heath Woods in Hampshire, a place quiet, isolated, and far removed from the familiar streets of Walton-on-Thames, something was discovered. At first, it was just a disturbance in the natural order of the forest, something that didn't belong. But as investigators moved closer, the truth began to take shape. Human remains. The search that had once been driven by hope now shifted into something else entirely: confirmation, finality, a devastating answer to the question no one wanted to ask out loud. It was Milly. The news didn't just break, it echoed. Across media, across communities, across a nation that had followed her story for months. The possibility that she might still be alive, that she might come home, was gone. Replaced by something far heavier. Grief. For her family, it was a moment that no words could fully capture. The transition from uncertainty to certainty is often described as closure, but in cases like this, closure is not peace. It is simply the end of waiting, replaced by a different kind of pain. Now, the investigation had a new focus. This was no longer a missing persons case. This was murder. The wooded area where Milly was found became the center of intense forensic examination. Specialists combed through the terrain, searching for anything, fibers, footprints, traces of movement, that could reveal how she had been brought there, and more importantly, who had taken her life. But even here, in the place where the truth should have been most visible, the answers remained elusive. The killer had been careful, deliberate, calculated. There were no obvious signs pointing to a specific individual, no clear trail leading back to a suspect. Whoever had done this had not only taken a life, they had managed to conceal themselves within the gaps of the investigation. And that made the case even more chilling, because it meant the person responsible was still out there. Living, moving, possibly watching. As the investigation continued, detectives began to widen their scope. They looked beyond the immediate area, beyond Walton-on-Thames, beyond even Surrey. They examined similar crimes, similar patterns, trying to identify whether this was an isolated act or part of something larger. At the time, there was no clear connection. But there was a presence, unseen but real. A predator who operated in the shadows, who selected victims with precision, and who understood exactly how to avoid detection. Years would pass before that presence would finally be named. In the meantime, life continued, but never the same. The Dowlers, despite their unimaginable loss, chose to turn their grief into something meaningful. They established Milly's Fund, a charity dedicated to protecting children and raising awareness about safety. It was a way to ensure that Milly's story would not end in silence, that her name would stand for something more than tragedy. But even as they worked to create change, questions lingered. Who did this? Why her? And how had they managed to escape justice? The investigation remained open, but progress was slow. Leads came and went. Suspects were considered and ruled out. Each new development brought a flicker of possibility, only to fade back into uncertainty. Until another name began to surface. Levi Belfield. At first, he wasn't connected to Milly Dowler. Not directly. But as time went on, his name became impossible to ignore. Belfield was already known to police, a man with a history, a pattern, a darkness that would only become clearer with time. He would later be convicted of the murders of Marcia McDonnell and Amelie DeLagrange, as well as the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy. His crimes shared a disturbing similarity: young women targeted in public spaces, attacked without warning, taken by surprise. The kind of crimes that suggested not randomness, but method. And suddenly, investigators began to look back, to revisit the details of Milly's case, to re-examine timelines, locations, possibilities. Could it be that the man responsible for these later attacks had been active long before he was ever caught? Could it be that the answer had been there all along, hidden in plain sight? As this line of inquiry developed, the case against Belfield began to take shape, but it would not be easy. Years had passed, evidence had aged, memories had faded. Building a case strong enough to stand in court would require more than suspicion. It would require proof. And proof in a case like this is never simple. Meanwhile, another revelation was quietly beginning to unfold, one that had nothing to do with the killer, but everything to do with the way the case had been handled. The Dowlers had believed during those early days that Milly's phone activity meant she was alive, that she was listening, that she was trying to reach them. But years later, a shocking truth would emerge. Her voicemail had been accessed, not by her, but by journalists. Reporters working for a major newspaper had hacked into her phone while she was still missing. They had listened to her messages, deleted some of them. And in doing so, they had unintentionally, or perhaps carelessly, given her family false hope. Hope that Milly was still alive. Hope that she might come home. That revelation would ignite public outrage unlike anything the case had seen before. It wasn't just about the crime anymore. It was about exploitation, about ethics, about how far some were willing to go for a story. The fallout would be massive. Investigations, inquiries, the eventual closure of the newspaper itself. But for the Dowlers, it was something deeply personal. Another layer of pain, another betrayal. Because in the middle of their worst nightmare, someone had turned their suffering into an opportunity. As the years went on, the case of Milly Dowler became more than just a murder investigation. It became a symbol, a reflection of justice delayed, of media overreach, of a system that sometimes fails those who need it most. But beneath all of that, the core question remained unchanged. Who killed Milly Dowler? And would they ever be held accountable? By 2011, nearly a decade after her death, that question would finally be answered. But the truth, when it came, would not bring the peace people expected. Because some crimes leave marks that never fully fade. And some stories refuse to end, even after the verdict is delivered. By the time 2011 arrived, the case of Milly Dowler had lived in the shadows for nearly a decade. 10 years of unanswered questions. 10 years of a name that never faded from public memory. 10 years of a family forced to live with both grief and uncertainty. But behind the scenes, something had changed. Investigators had gone back, not just to the evidence, but to the patterns, to the timelines, to the people who had once passed through the edges of the case without ever becoming its center. And one name refused to stay in the background any longer. Levi Belfield. By then, Belfield was already where many believed he belonged, behind bars, convicted, sentenced to life for brutal crimes that revealed a chilling truth about who he was, not impulsive, not random. Calculated, predatory. He targeted young women, chose moments of vulnerability, struck quickly, and left behind as little as possible. It was a pattern that now felt disturbingly familiar. As detectives began to re-examine Milly's disappearance through that lens, connections began to form, not obvious, not immediate, but enough to raise a question that could no longer be ignored. What if Belfield had been there that day? March 21, 2002. Walton-on-Thames. A schoolgirl walking home alone. An opportunistic predator. The pieces began to align. But suspicion isn't enough. Not in a case like this. Not in a courtroom. To bring Belfield to trial for Milly's murder, investigators needed something stronger, something that could survive scrutiny, challenge, and the weight of nearly 10 years. They needed to prove that he wasn't just capable of it. They needed to prove that he did it. The case built slowly, carefully. Every detail was revisited. Witness statements were re-evaluated. Movements were reconstructed. Timelines were tightened. Even the smallest fragments of information were treated as potential breakthroughs. Because in cases like this, the truth often hides in what was once overlooked. And then, piece by piece, a picture began to emerge. A man whose presence had gone unnoticed. A vehicle that may have passed through the area. Moments that at the time meant nothing, but now carried weight. Enough weight to move forward. In 2011, Levi Belfield was formally charged with the abduction and murder of Milly Dowler. For the Dowler family, it was a moment filled with conflicting emotions. Relief that progress had been made, fear of what was to come, and the realization that they would have to face in court the man accused of taking their daughter. The trial began at the Old Bailey, and with it came the reopening of wounds that had never truly healed. Courtrooms are meant to be places of justice, but for victims' families, they can also become arenas of pain, every detail dissected, every moment questioned, every memory brought back into the light. The defense challenged the evidence, questioned the timelines, raised doubts. Because that is how the system works, every case tested, every claim examined. But for the Dowlers, it was something deeply personal. They weren't just listening to arguments. They were reliving the worst moments of their lives. And then there was the cross-examination. The way questions were asked. The tone. The implications. It sparked something beyond the courtroom. Debate, criticism, anger. The way victims and their families were treated during the trial became a point of national conversation. Because justice, many began to ask, should never come at the cost of dignity. Still, the trial moved forward. Witnesses spoke. Evidence was presented. And slowly, the narrative became clearer. A man with a history of violence. A pattern of targeting young females. An opportunity that aligned with Milly's disappearance. In a case that, despite the passage of time, held together. Then came the verdict. June 23, 2011. After nearly 10 years, the question that had haunted this case finally received an answer. Guilty. Levi Belfield was convicted of abducting and murdering Milly Dowler. He was given a whole life sentence, meaning he would never be released. For many, it felt like justice. But justice in cases like this is complicated. Because no sentence, no matter how severe, can undo what was done. No verdict can bring back a life lost. No prison can contain the full weight of what a family has endured. For the Dowlers, it was the end of a long chapter, but not the end of the story. Because even after the conviction, there were still truths left to uncover. In 2016, another revelation would surface. Levi Belfield admitted to the full extent of his crime. The abduction, the assault, the murder. A confession that confirmed what the court had already decided, but carried a different kind of impact. Because hearing it made it real in a way nothing else could. There was no longer any doubt. No uncertainty. Just truth. And the weight of it. But even beyond the crime itself, the case had already changed something larger. The phone hacking scandal that emerged during the investigation had exposed a side of media culture that many had never seen before. The idea that journalists had accessed Milly's voicemail during the time she was missing was more than shocking. It was a violation of privacy, of trust, of basic human decency. Public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. Investigations were launched. Inquiries followed. And eventually, the newspaper at the center of it all, News of the World, was shut down. It was a moment that reshaped conversations around media ethics in the United Kingdom. Laws were examined, practices were questioned, boundaries were redefined. All because of what happened during one family's darkest days. And through it all, the Dowlers continued their work. Milly's fund became more than just a charity, it became a legacy, a way to turn unimaginable loss into something that could protect others, a way to ensure that Milly's story would continue to matter. Because in the end, this case is not just about what happened. It's about what it revealed. A predator who hid in plain sight. A system that took years to catch up. A media landscape that crossed lines it should never have approached. And a family that endured more than anyone ever should. Milly Dowler was 13 years old. A daughter. A student. A girl who should have made it home that day. And while justice was eventually served, her story remains a reminder of something far deeper. That evil does not always look the way we expect. That truth can take years to surface. And that even in the darkest moments, there are those who refuse to let a story be forgotten. Because some voices once heard echo forever.